Hey everybody, welcome to Attack Surface Visibility. What you can't see can't hurt you. I'm Jason Pfeiffer, Chief Strategy Officer for ReliaQuest, I think better known as JP. Today I'm joined by David O'Neill, Vice President of Information Security and CISO at iCIMS. David, welcome to the webinar. Thank you for joining. If you wouldn't mind maybe taking just 10 seconds, giving the folks a little bit about your background, a little bit about iCIMS.
Yeah, appreciate that, JP. So I've been doing cybersecurity for 20 plus years. We're just gonna kind of stop at 20. We don't have to count past that. In that time, I've done incident response. I've led vulnerability and risk management. I've been on the consulting side. I've been on the privacy side. I've kind of been a little bit in every single space. From an iCIMS perspective, we are an applicant tracking software, and we help recruiters hire and do that with complex workflows and do it en masse.
Nice, awesome. Well, good to see you again, David. We're gonna jump right in. I'm gonna hit a few housekeeping things really quickly. Right, your audio is going to be muted for the webinar. If you've got questions, then by all means, please ask us questions. Just join the conversation, ask questions in the Q&A box throughout the presentations. If we don't get to the questions at the end, because David and I kind of are going back and forth, right, we'll definitely follow up with you with email for anything that we don't get to during the webinar. And the webinar recording will be available to all attendees. So if there's something you missed or something you want to go back to, we'll get this video out just as soon as we're done. So with that said, let's get into it. A little bit about the agenda, right? We're going to be talking about the growing attack surface, right, and the challenges that poses to security operations teams. We're going to hit strategies for accelerating your threat response. How do you measure success? Then how do you look at unifying attack surface visibility in gray matter? And then the Q&A next steps. So really going to talk about why attack surface management is so important to organizations and to CISOs like David, and making sure that you're focused on the right things. And here's some of the lessons learned from David and others along the way. As we start to kind of paint the picture of attack surface, right, I think it's good to step back and think about how massive the attack surface actually is and how rapidly it's expanding. From OT to IT to misconfigured devices, network devices, you've got clouds, you've got multi-cloud environments, right? Security teams are essentially just overwhelmed by the complexity of threats, the complexities of their environments. Long gone are the days where, when David and I started, and I want to say he's a lot older than I am, but, everything was behind a firewall. It was in your data center. You had different network segments and some remote offices. But now with the cloud exploding, SaaS, everything else, there's just a myriad of different threats out there, right? And the bad guys are exploiting those. We're seeing new vulnerabilities, like the SharePoint vulnerability just came out a week or two ago, right? We've seen SAP vulnerabilities. We're seeing firewall vulnerabilities. Like, the bad guys know that you have an attack surface out there, and that it's really, really difficult to manage. And not just the external side of that attack surface, but also the internal attack surface that's behind your core firewalls. That's kind of hidden from the internet, but that also poses a massive risk rather. And that these standalone tools, right, having all this information around asset data and what's in your environment, standalone tools just create a whole nother set of problems for your security operations teams with, like, just fragmented visibility. You've got assets in all different places, but how do you know what that authoritative list looks like? How do you know where you have key vulnerabilities that you need to prioritize on? So David, I think I'll turn to you for, like, my first question is, like, what are your thoughts on these fragmented tools and just all the tools and things that exist in enterprise environments? Do they really create more problems than they solve for security teams?
Yeah, they absolutely do. And, even before we get into, the fragmentation of tools, as a consultant, one of the biggest issues I used to see is we'd go on site and we'd look at all the tools that somebody had to check that compliance box. And these were very capable tools, but they were all right in the beginning, like just past deployment, stopped maturing. And so it's a partial problem around the way that we mature our tools and get the most value out of them, and then the fragmented nature of the way that these tools allow us to get a holistic understanding of the problem. And I've yet to find a tool that gives us the ability to understand a holistic problem, right?
Yeah, no, it makes a ton of sense, right? More tools come more challenges. You need more people to operate those, right? Trying to get the data out of them. I often joke that security folks have, historically spent more time just trying to manage tools than actually using the tools to get the insights and the outcomes out of them that they're actually trying to get, right? Because it takes a lot of effort at the end of the day.
We are seeing a lot of trends kind of across all industries right now where a lot of CISOs are consolidating their tool sets because of the very problem, that you said, right? Being able to engineer them correctly, getting them into a good state, regardless of the type of tool it is. Like all of them take manpower and expertise, and they take a lot of time and effort away from sometimes the things that matter just to get a tool in a good spot, in a good place.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. See it all the time. So along those lines, like, do you see then like the expanding attack surface is primarily a technical challenge, things like the cloud, or is it more of a people process issue with this expanding attack surface? Like,
Yeah.
obviously, I think technology exposes it, right? But where does the fault really lie?
So I'm not going to say it's one or the other. It's actually both. The fragmentation between our tools creates gaps, and those gaps create slowdowns in the way that we coordinate internally, even just within a security department, right? Versus the way that we communicate with other departments. And so then we look at what the other piece, like the maturity of that tool. And sometimes we have processes that we build to help us get faster decisions that really end up causing more issues than they solve. Where if we were to have a more unified approach, we could get these questions answered a lot quicker in a way that sometimes we have to go rely on other business units. So getting the right information at the right time, at the right level is really important.
No, 100%. Yeah, that matters the most. So if you take this complex, ever expanding environment, right? The attack surface has kind of become all things. All things are internet connected these days. You take that in conjunction with this stat around 48 minutes to break out, right? And we've talked about this before from a ReliaQuest perspective, but as we did our annual threat report in early 2025, looking back at 2024, one of the things we found that I think was probably the most shocking to me is that, you know, bad guys are able to break into an environment and start moving laterally within 48 minutes, right? And that's the average time. The fastest we saw in 2024 was 27 minutes. There's been other reports that are very, very similar, if not, the exact same metrics from a time frame perspective. And I mean, if you start to think about that from a practitioner's perspective, right? Like you've got 48 minutes to detect it, investigate it, understand its impact to the business, and ultimately respond to it. And that's a minimal amount of time, right? So like David, like what are your thoughts on this 48-minute breakout time? And does this align with the urgency your team feels when responding to threats?
It absolutely does. And so I'd like to just take a couple steps back. And when you'd
Sure.
said previously that, we're going more and more to the cloud, right? And so we're seeing the more we go to the cloud, the larger our attack surface gets, right? And as we look at one of the other things that you had said is around like just the growing number of vulnerabilities. If you look at the chart, like over the years, it's gone like this and it's going up. And as we look at how quickly vulnerabilities are coming out, I think we can all agree like there's only going to be more. We're discovering more every year than we did the year before. And now with things like AI discovering vulnerabilities, the problem's only going to get worse. And so not only do we have the problem, the 48-minute breakout once they get in, but we're also finding that their time to discovery of a vulnerability once it's released and how quickly they can discover it and exploit it to get to this first system and then breakout, like that whole time frame is happening quicker and quicker. And now when we look at how businesses typically manage vulnerabilities, right? We patch, right? And we typically don't patch during production. So we patch these things at night or on weekends so it doesn't impact the business. Or we do new releases during these times. And so when we release, we do these new releases. And if a vulnerability gets discovered during this time, or there's one discovered anytime during off hours, like that 48 minutes becomes super critical. Super hard, right? Super hard to kind of be able to do all of that and do it during an off hour. Potentially, if your process relies on you going to X team and asking X team for anything, whether it's from information or just, can you go contain this? Can you go ask, is this normal? You are out of luck. You are not going to make that 48 minutes ever.
Yeah. And so, that's why it's important to understand that attack surface, right? Know what you have, know its criticality of the business, because you got to prioritize, right? Like you've got limited resources as a CISO. You've got to apply them to the most impactful places across your business and focus on those key threats, right? Because you can't ultimately respond to everything. So you got to make sure you're doing it to the right things and those things that are business impacting. So no, I love that. So we think about the attack surface, the speed, right? Now, here's another interesting stat from the same report, right? And you can go down on that report from our website if you haven't seen it yet. I highly recommend it. It's good reading. It's really insightful. A lot of key threats and information in there. But 50% of the incidents that we saw involved assets that were unknown or uncovered. And what we mean by uncovered here is that they had controls in place, they had technologies in place that were supposed to prevent certain things, but those assets weren't covered by those technologies or those controls, right? So you've got, in my mind, you've got two buckets, right? You've got this, hey, shadow IT, something else, someone spun up a box and we didn't even know it existed. And then on the second hand, you've got these assets that you know exist. They may be in your Active Directory, but they're not covered by your EDR for some reason. They missed getting that applied to it. They aren't behind certain firewall policies. They've got open VLANs or something else, right? So that's what we mean by we talk about uncovered, right? And so it just really interesting to think about is like how much of these incidents that we read about in the news all the time could have been prevented if you had made sure that you understood what your attack surface looked like, if you understood how many assets you had that had coverage or didn't have coverage by different controls. It's really quite impactful. And so, like David, I guess to you, I would ask, like, does that statistic of 50%, like, does that surprise you? Is it consistent with things that you've seen in your past? I know you said you've done some incident response and things like that as well. It's like, how does this metric stand out from your perspective?
It's scary, right? I think as an industry, right, as we're typically getting better about knowing what exists, but the uncovered piece I think is interesting. When we look, and depending on how you deploy your security stack, I've seen organizations that they spin stuff up. And because of the nature of the security tool, they don't do it as part of a golden image. They'll do it after deployment. If we went back and looked at your time to break out and how quickly they can identify things, like you could be introducing an exposed device that if you don't have a good process in place, right, to scan your golden images, or if it just comes out, which it happens, right, we now have a window to get EDRs installed, which is now like within an hour less. The bad guys are finding these things way faster than we are, right? Which can sometimes be really scary to think that they have a better discoverability. If we're a target of some of these high-level threat actors, they're going to find this stuff quicker than we have. So we really have to have good processes around making sure that all of our devices are covered. And if we have to spend our time somewhere, it has to be on the devices that are most impactful. What are the riskiest devices, and how do we make sure that those get protected?
Yeah, 100%. Like, one of my favorite sayings is like, I think it was originally by Ben Franklin around the Philadelphia fires way back in the day, but it kind of goes like this, and I may butcher it. So if there's any English majors out there or historians, don't hold me to this, but it's basically like an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of response, right? And so if you can go out there and do things to make sure that you have coverage and you have coverage in the right places and you've got controls in place that you're expecting to be there, right, you can prevent a ton of incidents from happening in the first place and give your team back their Fridays, give your team back their weekends, and ultimately protect your business. So it is really, really critical.
Agreed.
So if we start thinking about the challenges of managing the expanding attack surface, right, you've got the fragmented tools and visibility, right? You've got siloed security operations and IT teams, right? I think, David, you mentioned that, right? Of like, you got to go to different teams, ask them to get involved. They all have their own, objectives and things they're trying to accomplish, which makes it a little more complicated. You've got the inability to accurately prioritize risks, right? Like, how do you understand that all assets, and again, David, you mentioned this, was like, they're not created equal. Like, what's the ones that are going to have the most impact to the business? And if you don't know what your attack surface looks like, both internally and externally, like, you're going to have a really hard time doing that. And everything starts to blend together and everything, you start to treat it the same. You really have to focus on what is that business risk? And that kind of leads to the next one, which is the lack of risk in context and SecOps, right? Understanding the business, I think, is paramount, right? And understanding that you can't treat everything the same. And then lastly is like point in time testing, right? We see this time and time again of like, oh, people run pen tests yearly, they run some sort of analysis on a quarterly basis. But if you're not doing it real time and understanding what you have out there, like, you're prone to more risk, because all it does is takes one IT administrator to flip a switch at a change control at 10 o'clock at night to get something to work. and next thing you know, you have gaps in your coverage. So David, like out of the challenges that I've outlined here, like, all 5 of them, if you will, like, what do you think poses the greatest risk to enterprise security for organizations today?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think I'm actually going to say it might even be a step before these 5 things, right? And I was kind of alluding to it in the last slide, and that is when we look at visibility and tools, having good visibility and good tools can help us answer some fundamental questions. So maybe it's visibility, but it's the process, right? What process do we have in place from an IT perspective? Like, are we scanning our golden images before they go out? Are we scanning builds before they go out? If we're not, even like, I would take a bad tool before no tool, right? So getting a good process is really going to be the most impactful thing you can do. And I've been into organizations where they're like, we've got more vulnerabilities than we can action, right? And yeah, I think everybody has lots of vulnerabilities, or it's always a discussion around how we prioritize. But even before that, I honestly think if you have good processes in place, you're going to get a lot less noise in the environment, or you're going to play a lot less whack-a-mole. Then you can really focus on the things that matter when those 0 days come out, or we get you do have potential for then increasing visibility in your business context, right? Around, if I'm not playing whack-a-mole and trying to do a bunch, I know I have a good process. Now, when I get critical or high vulnerabilities that surface, I can determine, like, is this something that's just net new that we didn't know about? And I can stop playing the game of, why are we introducing vulnerabilities into systems that are just being created? Like, that should be a key indicator. If you're listening, I think one takeaway, if you look at the asset and it's created in the last 30 days and it's got a vulnerability on it that's older than a year, let's ask why.
Yeah, that's a great point, right? And helps you kind of think about, like, the whole process of too. It makes it not an emergency every time this comes up where you're fighting around trying to figure out how to go manage it. If you're managing it effectively in the front end, right? If you're kind of shifting left, then hopefully a lot of this stuff goes away. And when they do happen, you already know how to handle them, right? You've got those processes in place that you alluded to. That's like, now we know how to go out there and manage that effectively. Once we do find those things, because it's a 0-sum game, right? There are always going to be new vulnerabilities. There's always going to be something coming up. So go on.
But if we do it correctly, I think a lot of people get lost in the weeds, as we say, right? Because there are just so many things that are pulling on them, and they're still trying to figure out, even if you have the best tools, right? You're still trying to figure out what to prioritize. And if we can thin that out, then as we look at, like, how are our tools giving us visibility? How are they giving us business context? How do we then take that visibility, build in some business context to prioritize the risk, right? So we can communicate that risk to the business, create processes then to support that, where, again, we bring those siloed teams together, right? Where we can have more meaningful conversations other than, someone just saying, I've submitted 100 tickets, why aren't they done, right? Everyone loves to talk about ticket work, right?
Oh yeah, it never goes over well when you're like, hey, it's a Friday afternoon, here's 100 tickets of work that needs to go happen. So no, I hear you loud and clear on that, and totally agree. And I think it's a good segue into, how do you think about strategies to gain and operationalize this visibility? So if we look at, kind of, I think, 4 key areas in which you can think about strategies in which you want to go out there and operationalize that visibility across your environment, and I'll kind of call them out my order, right? Continuous discovery. One, it's got to be a continuous process, right? It can't be point in time. Things are changing too fast. You've got environments getting spun up, spun down in seconds, if not minutes, right? You've got more than just devices out there. You've got identities. You've got, headless assets. You've got, Kubernetes and things like that, Docker containers, right? So you've got to think about more than just, these are my assets and these are my physical servers. You've got a lot more out there that you need to understand. And identities is becoming, part of that new attack path as well. So you got to think about that from more than just a devices perspective. Internal versus external. I've alluded to this several times already, but I think it's, a lot of focus on the external footprint, right? And the different vulnerabilities that exist out there, what your attack, surface looks like from a bad guy scanning the internet. We all know that happens, thousands of times a day. But also the internal perspective, right? They're getting in and moving laterally in 48 minutes. Like, you have to understand, your internal environment just as well as you do your external environment. Like the perimeter is porous. We all know it. Vulnerabilities just expose that. So you have to assume they're going to get in, right? The assumed compromise. So you have to understand that internal piece of your environment just as well as your external piece. Now, I think this last one is probably the most important, which is like integrated and actionable, right? And it's not only the integrated process, I think that David, you alluded to, but it's also the integrated technologies, right? There's a lot of fragmented technologies out there. They all have good insights and some insights in them that you may need to do incident response and security operations. You got to find a way to seamlessly integrate those technologies so you have a very good viewpoint of what's actually happening in the environment on a continuous basis, and it's got to be actionable, right? It's got to be actionable so it can help you understand where to prioritize, what you need to do next, what are the best courses of action, because if it's just another data store, it's not going to be very, very beneficial to you or your team. So, David, do you think that security teams struggle more with gaining visibility or operationalizing the insights that they already have?
I think generally anybody can go out and buy a tool, right? And so we see that there's quite a bit of funding around tooling, right? And so most people have what I would consider to be okay visibility, right? And where we don't have vulnerability or visibility, it's easy to kind of sell the business on, like, we're not doing X, we should be, like, go get a scanner that scans, infrastructure as code, or scans code on deployment, or whatever the gap is. Container scanning. It's pretty easy to convince the business to go get a tool. What's absolutely harder is getting the business to invest in the people to operationalize it. We often think that tools will solve most of the problems, and because they're not integrated or actionable, right? It's just giving me visibility. I still have to take the data. I still have to do something with it. Still have to hand it to another team after we've triaged it to say, go do this thing. And I don't care if that's a vulnerability. I don't care if we're investigating or triaging an incident, right? This lack of operationalization to identify the business context, to be able to pull all these threads together. I mean, how often, I'd ask the audience, but how often have we tried to solve a problem where we got something really quickly over to IT, and IT shot it back because like one piece of data was wrong? Like, we gave them 100 assets, they look at the one asset that's not theirs and they kick it back and they say, I can't do it, right?
Yeah.
We see it all the time. So that operationalization around the visibility, what we do with the visibility, becomes really important.
So are there any specific strategies your team's been able to leverage to help better understand your environment and the risks throughout?
Yeah. So a couple different strategies. So the first one is, if you spend any time learning about the business, and I don't care if it's vulnerability management, I don't care if it's incident response, I don't care if it's understanding a business process flow, document it somewhere, right? I don't really care where you start documenting it, just document it somewhere. The goal is that a good tool will allow you to capture business context in a way where you can then learn to later action it based on that criteria. You could consider like having the ability to create a tag on an asset to say critical asset owned by X, whatever it is, that business context, start capturing it every time you do an incident analysis, you do vulnerability analysis, you interact with the business, you're learning about the context of the business. So figure out the best way for your organization to capture that data, right? And so the second thing on there, something I've already touched home on, and that is, don't get lost in the weeds. Understand where there's a process gap, right? Because that's going to be way more important, especially if you're the type of security organization where you don't own, it's not that you're part of IT, you're separate and you own accountability and IT is responsible, or a cloud hosting team or whatever, or development team, or whatever the name of the team that you're working with is, right? Really make sure that you're working with them directly.
Yeah, no, I love that too, because I think too often, to your point, we get stuck in the weeds. We're looking at a tactical problem. This is unpatched. And you do have to take that step back and look at the forest through the trees and understand, like, hey, there's a bigger process gap here. There's a bigger visibility gap here that we need to go find a way to solve. Because if not, we're just going to be playing whack-a-mole, to your point, like over and over and over again. So that's a great point.
I've yet to find a tool that helps me identify process gaps. That is a people process problem. You've got to do it. You got to do it partly by continuous discovery, right? On everything, scope everything in, and then using that time to operationalize the visibility into insights, which becomes then values, which then becomes actions you can perform.
No, I love that. If any entrepreneurs out there want to go figure out how to identify process gaps in organizations, let us know.
Right.
So if we talk about like the strategies to gain visibility, right, and operationalize it, right, let's talk about the benefits of gaining complete visibility, right? And I know it sounds a little bit like the mission impossible of complete visibility, but I think if you think about something that's continuous, integrated, and actionable, right, it's definitely possible in this day and age, right? So we think about the benefits, right? Going back to complete asset and identity awareness, understanding what assets you have where, understanding the identities associated with those assets and the identities in your environment and business context around them. Business context would be like users, roles. Are they, C-level executives? Are they IT administrators, right? What other business context can you get in? Are they in finance? Should they be processing payments? Should they not be, right? Anything that can help you understand how to best action those different assets. Right? Gap analysis and coverage validation, right? Understanding where you have gaps. And this one's a huge one for me. My background's all been in incident response, security operations, as many of you know. But it's like, the biggest problems we had was around those coverage gaps. Things that we thought were covered. We thought we had tools in place. We thought we had things out there. And then lo and behold, we'd find out the hardest way possible, which is in the middle of an incident that like, oh, why was there no EDR in this box? Why was it not logging to a SIM? Why was it not getting GPOs applied to it, right? You name the issue, it was there. And so doing a continual analysis of the gaps in your environment, validating coverage, making sure it's there as intended, right? It goes back to that whole saying I said before, like an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of response, right? That's the preventative piece that can really help you shift the needle on your teams, give your teams a time back and protect your organization. Third benefit, right? Smarter response decisions, right? When things do happen, and they inevitably will, right? Being able to respond to them faster, knowing, hey, if that's a test server, if that's just an average user in your environment, right? Immediately taking action so you can suspend their accounts. And even if it's a C-level executive, maybe it's more important to take actions on those, but using that business and asset context to make smarter response decisions. So you're not wondering, well, like, if we isolate this, is it going to break the business? Is this going to cost us millions of dollars? Am I going to get fired because I broke the business, right? The more context you have, the better decisions you can make from a response perspective. And I think last but not least, right, actionable remediation insights, right? Like understand what you need to go do to fix the issues that you found, understand where's the biggest priority of issues to go addressed, right? Making sure that you can get those insights brought into your environment and help your teams prioritize and focus. Because I'm sure no one on this call has an overage of people on their teams that are just looking for stuff to do, right? So helping them better prioritize what they have in front of them and then how they need to go off and address it. David, anything we missed? Any other benefits you can think of from when you start to do this, to achieving like continuous and unified visibility, right? Is there anything that you would add to this that we may not have covered?
Yeah, I think that there's two things. The first one is the context that we get, and assuming, right, if you can do this right, the context that you can get from it helps you to, that's the prioritization around risk, right? Because really what we're in the process of, should be in the business of, is reducing business risk. And we're constantly should be asking, well, what is the risk? What is the risk? How do we define the risk? How do we define it for the business? And so as we gain this capability to kind of knit everything together, to take immediate actions, we're really refining the way that we manage risk in the business. And so I guess the first thing is our ability to manage the risk in a very quick and actionable way is a huge game changer. Because, going back to your example, right? If we suspended, a C-suite member's account, they might get upset about it. But if I told them later, right, that if, let's say we did it and it was wrong, right? I would have asked if we would have been right, would you have wanted us to do it? And the answer was probably yes. So the risk, right, of the type of data that you have access to is worth the however much time and inconvenience that we put that C-suite member through, because they are one of the biggest risks to the organization. And I'm sure they don't want to be responsible for it having been their account, right?
I
So I
love
think,
that.
yeah, the ability to manage it, the risk effectively becomes a huge tool that a CISO can use and that teams can leverage to be able to do more than they have before, right? Where, look, yes, we may make mistakes, but if it's a 50-50 chance, at what percent do I have to be wrong and then right to be able to allow the business to do this? Figure out what that percent is and then kind of run with it. The second thing I think if we can do this right, is it helps collaboration with other parts of the business. Because again, if I can effectively discuss the risk, I'm going to get buy-in really quick. And especially if you level set with the business, what is a critical risk, what's a high risk and a medium and a low, and you can come to them and say, look, when it's a high risk or a critical risk, like we're going to come, right? Like there's a fire and we're going to act quickly to save the business because there's the potential of X damage. You're going to find that the business is going to align. So that collaboration and alignment becomes very easy.
Yeah, no, I love both those points. And that first point around, like, if you ask them if you did it, you responded to something, you disabled their account, and you were wrong, but would they wanted you to do it, right? That's such a great point, because in 99.9% of the cases, I can't imagine some C-level executive being like, no, I would never want you to disable my account, right? If they thought they were going to be an attack vector, and we've seen from some of the latest scattered spider reports, right? Like CFOs have been a ripe target for bad guys and threat actors, and so they're on front and center, if you will. And so it's a great point, and I think so many people are scared about taking some of these automated response actions and doing things to kind of shift left from a response perspective. But I think if you really go back to your business, it's like, hey, do you want to end up on the front page of the Journal for all the wrong reasons? Do you want to be in the Financial Times for all the wrong reasons, and now have to report it out to the SEC and put it in your financial reports? Like, do you want to do that, or do you want me to kind of err on the side of caution and go ahead and start doing things in a much more aggressive manner? I think, again, 9 out of 10 times, depending on the business, they will say yes, right? So I think you just have to start teeing up to have those conversations with your business if you haven't. And David, sounds like you've done a phenomenal job at doing that.
Yeah, I think you'll find when talking with most C-suites, like most of them understand cybersecurity to the prospect of they don't want it to be associated with them, right?
Yeah.
And so I definitely don't say, like, I'm not saying you should go to your C-suite team and like use fear tactics. Like, that's not it. But helping them understand the business risk, right, is really key. Most of them, they want to know, they want to understand. And so part of it, again, is about setting those risk or those severity levels, and then kind of working with them to say, look, when these type of things happen with this type of risk, we're going to act to protect the business. Now, we're going to monitor, we're going to make sure we're doing it right. We're going to take every precaution to do it, with the goal of not impacting the business. But if it happens, it happens. We would rather take that server down versus all the data on that server going out. Yes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. That's a great point. So we talked about like the strategies, the benefits, right? And I think important with any kind of plan you're trying to put in place is like, how do you measure the success of that program, right? And the effort that you're trying to do. And so here's some examples of, I think, of key metrics, right? And David, I'd love you to get your thoughts on this as well. But some of the ones that like I've seen be the most successful in organizations that I've worked with is kind of boils down to these four, right? Current coverage. And by coverage, by control, really talking about like your endpoint, your SIM, your even Active Directory from a GPO perspective. Great control, a lot of great policies in there. Some of your application firewalls and things like that. But like, what coverage do you have by that control? Do you have all the devices in your EDR that you have in your Active Directory? And do you have the visibility in your SIM as well if you're expecting it, right? So think about that from a current coverage perspective by control. The next part of that, which, I've had some good, healthy debates with folks about this, but it's like current coverage by environment, right? What I mean by environments, like cloud versus on-prem, AWS versus GCP versus Azure, right? Prod versus test. A lot of times organizations, we think about it just as a whole of like visibility. I could see 85%. Well, is that entire 20% of coverage you're missing from a visibility perspective in your cloud environment? Is it where your crown jewels are? If you're not thinking about how you kind of bifurcate that and segment it up into different chunks, right? You're missing some really good data that can help you understand of like, hey, if these are your 5 core environments where your crown jewels are at, where do you have coverage from that perspective, not just the environment as a whole? So that's what I really think about as I think about current coverage by environment. Now there's the mean time to detect an exposure, right? So you think about these lacks of coverage, these new unpatched assets, think about those as exposures, right? How long does it take you to actually find those from when they've been implemented? Like David, you had a good example earlier, like, hey, we just rolled out a server, but it's got a vulnerability from a year ago, right? You just, you detected it as it went live, right? But the exposure's been there for a year. Now, how long does it take you once you know about that vulnerability, once you know about that issue, to go off and resolve that? That's the NTTR around kind of exposure management. What does that mean time to go off and fix something once you've identified it? Whether it's getting an EDR agent deployed, getting visibility in your SIM, getting some additional control in place or in front of that specific asset. How long does it take you to actually resolve that? And that's how you can bring back some quantifiable metrics to the business to help them understand, hey, we're doing this. We found all these vulnerabilities, all these exposures, and now it's taking us 10 days to go remediate, and how you're driving that maturity and getting that down into hours, if not minutes, from when you identify those things. And that's how you can really measure success, continue to justify budget, spend, headcount, et cetera. David, what do you think are the most valuable metrics, if you will, for assessing how teams are managing their attack surface and associated exposures?
I actually think it's the top two, right? The current coverage by control and then by the environment. And so as we look at control, like what does that mean? And so you listed a couple of them. And there's lots of frameworks out there that will say like there's a bunch of controls for this and a bunch of controls for that. And why they can be helpful. And if your tools understand those controls, they can be a good way to discuss it. But what are and I would say, like, do you have a top 10 list of things that you think, like, what are the top 10 most critical things that you have, right? The asset has, privileged access management. It's got the EDR on it. It's got whatever those things are. Like, I don't know, whatever they are, because I often see people try to get into the game of, well, I'm going to go benchmark it versus CIS, or I'm going to benchmark it versus this. And that is not easy. It's hard, right? Even when you have tools with visibility, they typically only have partial coverage because those frameworks aren't designed with a tool in mind. They're designed across the entire business process and the life cycle of that device. So understanding that controls represent how you manage risk. Okay, and so if you're talking about a specific risk, or you're talking organizationally the whole risk, identify your top whatever and communicate the coverage of the controls, right? So it's not just I have this one control, it's how good are our controls, and then how much coverage do we have of those controls. When we talk about environment, to me, I could say it's environment, it's segmentation. It is, what does the business actually care about? Because environment, I could say lower versus prod. I could say, internal network versus external network, DMs, whatever it is, whoever your audience is, the environment should be ways that you communicate maybe some responsibility, or you're highlighting the risk. What's, again, the story arc that you're telling here is what, right? And so as we look at those, like mean time to detect an exposure, mean time to resolve an exposure, those are board level metrics, right? Those should be on the board. These other two should be on the board. They're a lot harder to communicate. You got to figure that out. These two should definitely be on your board deck, because the time it takes to identify helps the business understand how mature your program is around identification, right? If you're scanning once a week, that number is not going to be super flattering, right? And that, hey, if that's an acceptable level of risk for an environment, like, okay, 5% we do this, 95% might have a different outlook. And then the time to resolve is how good are we at protecting the business? We've all said this before, and that it's no longer a matter of if I get compromised, it's when I get compromised. And if that holds true, then our ability to detect and then resolve become key metrics, right? If we truly believe what we're saying there, then those are really important.
Oh, 100%. 100%. No, I love that. Absolutely love that. And I think you're spot on. So if we put this all together, right, and kind of take a step back, right, think about everything we talked about, right, the strategies, the challenges, right, like bad guys are moving faster than ever. Like you have to be on top of your attack surface. You have to find ways to implement a continuous discovery strategy, right? Focus on those critical controls. David, I think you're spot on, right? Like break those controls down by what are the most critical controls in your environment, right? Whether it's you're identifying them, regulators, et cetera, right? But prioritizing those critical controls and understanding how those are impacting your attack surface and where those gaps may be. And I think lastly, and probably one of the most important is like integrating into your existing SecOps workflows, right? If this data is siloed, if it's in multiple places, if it's not usable, tangible, it's not helping you both tactically and strategically, then like it's not going to serve your business. It's not going to serve your team and you and your mission as well as you'd like it to, right? So think about that as you're thinking about the attack surface moving. And, I guess, last question to you before we kind of start to wrap this up, David, is like, do you agree like security teams need to shift to a more offensive strategy to manage their attack surface more effectively? Like, do they need to shift more left to do this? I mean, I would say it's not new, but do you think it's more of like paramount to a successful security program this day and age?
I think there's some fundamentals that we've talked about. Visibility allows us to ask questions to identify where our focus needs to be. And I think in the example I gave earlier, it's a good example of I need to shift left to the business process to say, how often are we scanning our golden images that we're making? If we make them once a month, maybe we need to do it more frequently, or we need to look at what we're scanning if we're finding ones that are a year old, right? Like what kind of exceptions do we have in place? How mature is the tool that we have? So when we use the word offensive, I think in my mind, we spend less time playing whack-a-mole against the vulnerabilities that are on the far right, and we shift left into the business process to really focus on how do we fix it here? Because we can fix these here one off, but eventually we're going to burn out the teams because they're just never ending. We really need to focus on the left. And so as we say offensive, I think proactive, right? I'm going out to do this. And I think the mindset shift that we need here is we have to have good data. And we can't do a lot of this without good data. We can only, make guesses on it. And I would love to say that IT teams they always understand our questions accurately and they're always going to answer accurately. Usually what I find, like they want to answer accurately, but there's some lack of context. Well, they didn't know that I meant when I asked how often they scanned, I meant not when they make the golden images, but when they deploy the golden image to a system, right? Oh, like we scan the golden image all the time, but we don't update it ever, right? Like the kind of nuance, right? Because let's be honest, as security practitioners, we're creating work for other teams.
Oh, yeah.
And we need to make sure we're creating work in the right place. I can have the conversation. We can continue to go patch all these vulnerabilities over here, or we can take, a week and we can review this process in detail and fix this so we don't get these anymore, right? And I really think that offensiveness means asking more business questions around how we solve it. And you cannot do that if you don't have the right visibility. And I do think as we look at how we build our ops teams and how they interact across the business and how we can take actions, that the increased visibility allows us to decrease noise, which allows us to then go back and actually utilize our time on things that we need to be. And we go all the way back to the Target breach, like they had the alert, they just didn't have the people or the process or they had too much noise, right? And so for so long, all of these tools, every tool you have now creates alerts and it creates work for your team. And so the more you get overwhelmed, right, the harder it is to do this shift left approach.
Yeah, no, you're spot on. I do think proactive is probably a better choice of words, right? Because I think what I was trying to say was like get on the offense. But yeah, no, I think you're completely spot on. So I want to bring us home, right? And I mean, I want to talk about like the ReliaQuest view and a unified view of attack surface management, right? We've recently released our gray matter discover capability, right? Taking all the different telemetry points that we have across our customers' environments, leveraging your existing technology stack, right? Things that are already integrated to gray matter, bringing that data in and helping you discover those assets, identities, vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, coverage gaps, non-compliant devices, logging issues, et cetera, and doing that seamlessly. And it's already built into our security operations workflow inside of gray matter. So it gives you that seamless outcome of understanding those assets, those gaps, everything that we talked about today, taking that over, the years of doing this with our customers, understanding their challenges in this area and all their pain points, and bringing that into our platform. So if you've got more questions on Gray Matter Discover, happy to get on a call offline, talk to your customer success manager, talk to one of our sales representatives, happy to help answer any questions around it. But that's how we are looking to solve this problem, and doing it in a seamlessly integrated way, leveraging the technologies you already have and giving you those insights seamlessly integrated to your security operations workflows. So that's it for the kind of sales pitch part of this. We'll get into a Q&A, David. I think we went a little bit long, but I think from the questions, let me pull this up here. I've still got to get better at managing this webinar software, but I think we have time for one question, and then we'll get back to everybody else who threw a question in the chat. And thank you for doing that. We'll get back to you via email. Make sure we follow up. First question: what are some of the most overlooked risks or exposures that enterprises should be paying more attention to? David, do you want to take that one?
Yeah. So, and again, this depends a little bit on your business, right? But we're seeing a trend around, and this is not a new trend. The last couple of years, we've seen more and more attacks against APIs, right? And so it's the things that, and look, if you go to your IT team and you're going to have a long conversation, well, what actually is an API, or is it what we call a BFF or a SPA or a back-end system or a front-end system? The long story short is, like, when we look at these systems that deliver JSON results, and it's not through a dedicated web interface, right? Even the web interface can go back and hit it, like anything that's doing that type of work, right? How are we protecting those? So doing good vulnerability discovery is super important to identify where those may have issues.
Oh, that's a great point. That's a great point. And I think just to bring us home, right? Like, I still see some of the basics right out there, and I think APIs is a big one that's coming up, and I'm glad you mentioned it, because I see the impacts of those out there in environments, and people trying to get their arms around those as developers are rolling out new APIs that are external facing constantly. I also see just a lot of the basics where, like, people just have to get back to the basics and making sure they have coverage on their core controls, where they've spent millions of dollars on core technologies and capabilities, endpoint, SIEM, cloud security, posture management solutions, and they're still not understanding the full depth and breadth of coverage from that perspective. So I think, don't feel like you have to overcomplicate it. Focus on the basics, back to the basics, and start there, and then you can start to find the more meaningful things in your environment. And again, I think David said this a lot, but, like, go back to the business. What's most important to the business, and maybe start there, because you don't want to treat all things equal. If your core crown jewels don't leverage APIs, then maybe it's not a great place to start. Maybe it is, but focus on what you think makes the most sense to your business based on the rest of the business. So,
Jason, I would add that it's back to that previous slide. It's the current controls, pick your top 10, and then it's by the environment, what matters to the business, right? Yeah. Those two things, and then that trickles down into the visibility and the exposure and all those other things.
No, that's a great way to end it. I'm getting told here on the back end that we've got to wrap this thing up. So thank you, everybody. Again, thanks for the questions. Thanks for participating. We'll send you a link to download this so you can go back to, and if you want to go back to anything that David or I said, but we really appreciate you. David, thank you for being here. Greatly glad to have you. And thank you for the time. Everybody have a great day.
Thanks for having me. Take care.
Absolutely. Cheers, guys.